All right, it's 10 o'clock and I'm going to go ahead and get started because this is a very interactive session and I need as much time as possible for you all to do the activities. I appreciate the opportunity for everyone to be incognito, but at some point I'm going to ask you to turn your camera on and engage with the rest of the group. So you can stay dark for right now, but in a little bit you're going to have to kind of come on camera for just a little bit, okay? So I don't have a moderator actually for this session, so I'm trying to watch the waiting room and the chat. If you have a question, since this is a smaller group, I would say go ahead and unmute until that becomes a problem, and then I'll tell you to put them in the chat. But for right now, I'd rather focus on you than that. So let's go ahead and get started. My name is Carmen. I am the Vice President of Programming at Seeds of Literacy. We're a nonprofit literacy agency in the city of Cleveland. We're the only, we are the only program that is certified by Pro-Literacy in the state of Ohio. We're not an Aspire funded program, but we do provide adult literacy for anyone ages 18. I think our oldest student is 82 now. So this session is Memoir Writing After Trauma, and it's about finding voice, finding power, and improving student writing altogether. So the overall goal of memoir writing is really to help students generate a writing sample. So one of the things that a lot of instructors complain about is just that trying to get students to write is like pulling teeth. And the thing is that students actually don't hate writing. They hate writing for us because we give them these dry GED high set task prompts that really don't mean anything for them and they're not relevant. A lot of them haven't written for an audience in a really long time, so they're a little bit self-conscious about their writing. So us giving them a prompt kind of out of the blue and then expecting them to write an entire essay, it's a really daunting task. Writer's block is a real thing. Our students experience that. And sometimes we think of writer's block as just being something that professional writers experience, but our students experience writer's block when we give them a prompt. The other thing I think that makes writing difficult right now is that the HSC tests don't really emphasize writing as much as they did before. So students know that they can pass the GED test without passing any of the written responses. So they aren't as willing to spend class time on that. So the other thing I would say is that, you know, at Seeds of Literacy, one of the things that we have found is that our students write all of the time, whether it's poetry or whether it's stories, you know, fiction stories, or whether they're writing their own life stories. Many of them actually have the desire to write. And so capitalizing on that desire is a great way to get students to focus on writing, because it makes the mechanics of writing more relevant, more purposeful when it's something that they have an interest in writing. So let's talk about the goal. The way that I structure this workshop and the way that I structure writing with students is through a writer's workshop. And so a writer's workshop is, if you've never heard of it before, a writer's workshop is an opportunity for writers to get together with other writers, to share some of the things that they've worked on, to get feedback, to get encouragement, and so that writers don't feel necessarily lonely. It isn't an individual process typically, but often it's done kind of in a vacuum and isolation. So a writer's workshop gives students, and I shouldn't say students, but gives writers an opportunity to come together with other writers, to get feedback on their writing, to get ideas, and to share, and to just kind of create some connection with other writers. So the writer's workshop uses writing as a context for improving writing. So you can create a grammar lesson, you can create a language lesson within the context of a writer's workshop. And it's also a way for students to use the pen as a way to heal rather than some other destructive behaviors that they might have been involved in. Give me just 1 second so I can let another person in. Okay, so there's an organization that's called, I have to look at it's the National Association of Health and Mental Health Services. And one of the things they talk about is just that 70% of Americans have experienced some form of trauma in their lives. So we'll talk a little bit about what a memoir actually is, we'll talk about what trauma is, and then we'll talk about how memoir writing can help students process their trauma a little bit differently. So what is a memoir? A memoir is a telling of a true story of an event. And it really is meant to be descriptive and to help put your writers in the kind of in the shoes of the person who's reading it. So they want to create that experience for the audience so that the audience member feels like they're transported into your memory. And it's supposed to be a true story, and it's supposed to be very experience-based and recreate the sensory experience that you had when you went through something. So a memoir is a little bit different from an autobiography. An autobiography is more giving facts in a chronological order about your life, but it isn't really about making people feel like they were in it. A memoir is supposed to make you feel like you were in it, where you can really feel where the student is coming from and what their experiences were. So the reason I have this picture of James Fry's A Million Little Pieces on my screen, some of you may be familiar with James Fry, but he was one of Oprah's book club choices, and he wrote this book about his addiction and describing it as feeling like he was in a million little pieces. And as it turned out, his memoir was untrue. That's the number one rule of a memoir, is that it should be a true story. So it was a really big scandal. Oprah actually made him come on her show and apologize to all the people that he deceived who purchased her book thinking that it was somebody's true story. So now let's talk about what trauma is. So just really quickly, do you mind typing in the chat, what do you think of when you hear the term trauma? How would you define it? Or what do you think trauma is? What is trauma? Okay, so I'm having flashbacks to the CLAVE conference here where people were chatting to me and I couldn't see it. And I'm looking at the chat and I don't know if you guys just aren't participating. Okay, thank you, Diana. Something you experience or something that you experience or witness that affects you very negatively. Thank you for that. So most people, when they think about trauma, they think about the causes of trauma. They think about the event, the traumatic experience. But the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration defines trauma as this, and pardon me for reading, I'm going to read their words exactly. But they define trauma as the result of an event, not the event itself, but the result of an event or a series of events or circumstances that's experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. I want to emphasize experience because sometimes when someone's retelling trauma, they may tell, like say a child is talking to their parent about an event that they found traumatic. And the parent might say, oh, well, that wasn't a traumatic experience. That was just this. It doesn't matter if other people experienced it as traumatic for it to be traumatic. It just has to be you experiencing as traumatic for it to be traumatic. So you don't need external validation for your trauma. If you experienced an event as traumatic, it was traumatic. You don't need someone else's permission for that. So their definition goes on to say that that experience has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So some of the causes of trauma that we think of, rape, domestic violence, natural disasters is actually the second highest cause of trauma. So living through a hurricane or earthquake, you can imagine the people who lived through Katrina, the types of trauma that they experience. Illness, injury, death, and grieving, all of those things can be causes of trauma, but so can living in poverty. So can living through a pandemic. So can living through a 4-day election process. I'm just kidding about that last one. But all of these, there are lots of different things that can create trauma because, again, the trauma is the result of that. It is a person's experience of, or the sum total of experiences. So for example, sometimes when people feel like, when we're threatened by something, our body has 3 different responses: fight, flight, or freeze. Freeze is a new one. That one's kind of, well, not very new, but I think it's one that's starting to become part of the lexicon around trauma, because initially people just talked about fight or flight. And then people started sharing, well, but I had this experience where I was robbed and I just kind of froze and I couldn't really defend myself. And so they're acknowledging that freeze is actually now a response as well. So that fight, flight, or freeze response that we feel when someone almost hits our car, or we see a deer and realize that it's a dog on a chain and that it's no threat to us, or anytime something that causes that adrenaline rush in our bodies, that's a response to something that would make us fight, flight, or freeze. Fight, flight, or freeze. So with trauma, people experience that fight, flight, or freeze experience over a prolonged period of time so much that their body never comes down from it. So that relief that you feel after an event that's got your heart pumping and your blood pumping and your adrenaline going, that relief that you feel afterwards, someone who's dealing with trauma doesn't experience that relief. They live in that sense of hyper awareness. And so it can be very difficult, because what happens is people hide the trauma that they feel out of shame, or and so they don't get the validation that they feel that they need. Or what also happens is that because of those chemical responses, that adrenaline rush that never seems to dissipate, it begins to impact the brain, which of course impacts student learning. So let's talk about the connection between memoir writing and trauma. So there are therapeutic benefits of memoir writing. And the first one is just that sense of connection. So we all have very different personal experiences. We can all have one similar experience, an experience that is in very, very different ways. So when we share those experiences, it brings us into a more communal space, so you don't feel quite as isolated. And since adults, especially adult learners, are social beings, that connection, that sharing of those experiences can be really therapeutic for people. They don't feel like they're the only one who's ever gone through something. Sometimes students feel like they're the victim. Always, they feel like, oh, bad things always only happen to me. And them hearing that other people have similar experiences, it feels like, okay, so this is just a part of life. And it isn't so much about me, but it is about living. And now I've got some folks in connection who can kind of help me process what I'm experiencing. So even though our experiences are very individual, often we can find commonalities in the experiences that we share. And sometimes finding those commonalities can help people realize, like, oh, I didn't even realize that that bothered me. So for example, I remember a group sharing once where one woman talked about her father's absence in her life, and she talked about it as abandonment. And another girl talked about her father's, telling her father that she had been molested by one of his friends, and her father not believing her. And when the student whose father left physically described that feeling of abandonment, the students whose father just didn't believe her described a similar experience of abandonment that she had never been able to name before that. So that sharing of experiences created that connection, but also helped her process some of the things that she was experiencing for herself. So the thing about it can also create education, because people start to find the meaning, some of the meanings behind their experiences, like, oh, it wasn't that he didn't believe me, it's that he completely abandoned me and kind of favored his friends. So there was this extra layer that came to light because of it. It can also help students learn from their experiences. They have an opportunity to process it and maybe even see how someone else dealt with the similar experience. Sometimes we think our response is the only way, so sharing can also help with that. But it also can be very transformative, because we can learn from those experiences. With Cole's learning cycle, one of the things that's really important part of learning is reflection. And so sharing those stories gives us a chance to reflect, especially if we're able to look at someone else's story and use that story to help us see some things differently in ours. So it can kind of help the students feel a sense of power and control over their experiences and over their lives. So there's also a healing benefit to memoir writing. So one of the things that happens when students actually write about their experiences, this is where people will journal at the end of the day, or journal when they're going through something, is that there really is a healing effect to it. It makes the event more real. It gives students back their power, because they're able to narrate the story their own way. Sometimes students have you ever heard someone share a story of maybe they're sharing an experience of sexual assault, and when people are talking about them, the police come to take their report, they're calling them the victim. They go to the hospital to have a rape kit done, they're called the patient. And so they reclaim those stories when they write them, and they say, I'm not a victim, I'm not a patient, I'm a survivor, right? So sometimes sometimes writing can provide that healing effect of helping students identify in a different way. When they're a victim, they may react to the world as a victim, but once they re-narrate it as a survivor, then they face the world in a completely different way. So that's another healing effect that can happen. It can also validate students' experiences. Sometimes a student may experience something and someone in their life experienced it very differently. And so they invalidate that. When they're able to write their own stories, they get that sense of, this was real and this did happen and I have a right to my own story. It also can remove the sense that something is shameful and needs to be hidden. Being able to tell a story and see that, you know, when I tell this story, I wasn't the person who did anything wrong. It can help free them from the guilt and shame that they've been carrying for a long, long time. So I should mention too that getting students to write doesn't necessarily mean that they have to write about their trauma. But what often happens when you do memoir writing is that those are the stories that come out. Those are the stories that students want to share because those are the things that are at the forefront of their minds. They're the things that they've been thinking about and trying to process. So you don't have to say, hey, we're going to write about your trauma. You can just give students a writing prompt and have, and just see what comes out of it. And we'll talk about some prompts that you can use a little bit later on. So there was a study that was conducted in 2005, and the participants in that study who wrote about their most traumatic experiences for 15 minutes, just for 4 days in a row, experienced better health outcomes up to 4 months later. So there's that immediate sense of relief of getting something on paper, but then there are the lasting effects of actually being able to deal with the traumatic experience. Okay. The other thing is that creative expression can give students an opportunity to process some of the things that they've been through. So writing about their story doesn't have to be, you know, all based on fact. It can be a creative expression of it. I remember not long after I got divorced, I wrote a story about a fairy tale, like just rewriting the fairy tale of my life. And so it was about this little princess who was, she was hanging out with all the other princesses, and there was this prince, and all the other princesses were just so excited about this prince, and they were putting on their makeup and trying to look pretty for him, and she was like, I'd rather go play soccer. And so eventually, just spending a lot of time around her friends and around this prince, she fell in love with this prince. She married the prince, and then when she married the prince, he turned into a dragon. So she slayed the prince and lived happily ever after. That was my story, right? So re-narrating it, giving it a creative spin, it just was like a way to process that whole experience. So our students can benefit from that as well. All right, so let's talk a little bit. Oh, I'm sorry, using these two screens so I can manage the chat. I can't get my mouse back. Where did it go? Okay, here we go. All right, so memoir writing can be a great tool for writing instruction because, again, when students start to generate writing samples, then you have something that you can analyze to see what students are actually doing with their writing, and it gives you a way to provide a little bit more feedback. So this picture is a picture of one of our clubs at Seeds of Literacy. So we do clubs for students between class sessions. We have a reading club, we have a creative writing club, or we have a book club, I should say, not a reading club, a book club, we have a creative writing club, we have a digital literacy club, there's a math club, excuse me. And our clubs, since our program is very individualized and we provide one-to-one instruction, students pretty much work with a tutor, but the clubs give students a chance to work with tutors and other students together. And it's a very communal space that creates a sense of connection. We've noticed that students' attendance improves when they're engaged in those kinds of activities. But the memoir writing part of it, it really allows you to give feedback to the students on their writing on something that they care about, and appreciative. The feedback is more appreciative than what students typically experience in a classroom setting. And I'll give an example of that in just a little bit. Excuse me, 1 second. All right, so one thing that a lot of folks who teach about trauma will share is that one thing that helps to combat trauma is building resilience in students. So building resilience can help students eliminate some of the effects of their trauma, and the ways that we can do that is by trying to understand, helping students try to understand why an event happened. Often, the reason people carry a lot of shame and blame around their childhood trauma is because they've been allowed to carry the guilt of that. And so when they start to explore that, understand why it happens. If you were a child and something happened to you, you were abused or neglected, that wasn't your fault. A lot of times that can help understanding that you were not the aggressor, you were not the reason for your trauma, can be very liberating, and helping students understand what happened can really help them get beyond it. It also helps to, when they're, especially in a memoir setting, if a student is sharing something about their experience and someone validates that experience, or someone says that they understand that, what students experience when they share about their trauma in their lives is that their event is minimized. Oh, you should have got over that. I mean, your brothers and sisters came out fine, right? So sometimes people minimize their experiences. The memoir writing and writing workshop allows students to actually get feedback that doesn't minimize their experiences. I'm sorry, hang on one second. There's someone in the room. This is distracting. Okay, so it also helps students to connect with people. If you can connect with people who understand and can provide a support system, that also helps to build resilience. The active journaling helps to build resilience because it's a form of self-care. And then also, practicing spiritual beliefs is another way that you can build resilience. Even though you don't have to necessarily do that in the classroom, it could always be a reflection for students to do at home if that's territory where you just aren't really comfortable treading. So let's talk about how to do all of this. And this is where I'm going to need you all to participate. So take a sip of that coffee and get ready. So the writing workshop is actually a 4-step process. And while this slide is doing what it does, I want to just give a shout out to my colleague, Katie Crucera, who is a designer extraordinaire. She makes us always look good when we go out and do presentations. So all this little fancy stuff that you see, none of that is me, that's Katie. So let me just give that quick shout out. But the writing workshop is a 4-part process. I'm going to take you through a writer's workshop, like an abbreviated version of it during this session, so that you can see what it feels like to be on the student side of it, and so you can see how I'm facilitating it from the instructor side of it. So it basically has 4 parts. There's a mini lesson, there's actual writing, there's conferring, and there is the sharing. So the mini lesson it's a brief, focused lesson in which students are engaged in examining one quality of exemplary writing, followed by independent writing practice. So instead of giving students a writing sample, instead of making students generate a writing sample and they're just responding to a prompt without any focus on a specific writing skill, the writer's workshop, you start off by focusing on one thing that you want students to be able to do. So this is where we're trying to get to today, okay? So an example of that, and this is going to be a mini lesson because we don't have as much time and I want you to get more time writing than me talking. So the mini lesson for us today is going to be is show, don't tell. So show, don't tell is a way to get students to think about how to be more descriptive in their writing. So that could include me. I could maybe do a lesson on adjectives and adverbs and what they are and how we can use them to make our writing more picturesque, more colorful, in a way to make our writing more engaging, so that we can draw someone who's reading our story into that story, okay? So I have a sample sentence that I'm going to read here. And the sample sentence is, Lisa stepped outside. It was a sunny day. Okay. So there is a sentence. It tells you what's happening, but it doesn't really pull you into what's happening with Lisa. You don't feel what Lisa's feeling. You don't see what she smells. You don't hear what she hears. It's very, very factual. And so creative writing and memoir writing is supposed to be more experiential. It's supposed to help draw your person in so they can really experience what you're experiencing. So I want you to just close your eyes for a second. You're all off camera, so if you don't do it, I won't know. But close your eyes for a second and now listen to Lisa's story and tell me, think about how much more descriptive it is when I show you what happens instead of telling you what happens. So I'm going to show you with my words. So the first sentence again was, Lisa stepped outside. It was a sunny day. The second sentence is, Lisa stepped onto the porch, locking the door behind her. She felt the warmth from the concrete steps on the soles of her feet, right? So two different ways of saying the same thing, but one that kind of pulls you in a little bit more because you've all had the experience of feeling warm concrete beneath the soles of your feet. So I don't have to tell you that it's a sunny day. You know from hearing that the sidewalk is very warm that it must be a sunny day. Okay, so that would be the mini lesson. Now, if I were doing this with students, I would talk about maybe what an adjective is. Maybe I'd have them write a couple of sentences. I might ask them to add a couple of adjectives to their sentences to make them a little bit more picturesque. In fact, I might ask them to write 5 sentences about what happened to you yesterday. And so they might write 5 sentences. And then I might ask them if they can add an adjective. And I'll talk about what an adjective is and see where they can add an adjective into their day. And of course, we're going to talk about the fact that adjectives just describe nouns, right? And so then I might talk about the fact that we might want to describe how someone did something. And in that case, we would need adverbs. So I'm teaching them about adjectives. I'm teaching them about adverbs. And so because we're talking about something that they did, they're able to see how to actually practice it, how they can use adjectives and use adverbs in their writing. I might do, now your mini lesson really is only going to be about 5 or 10 lessons because you want to spend the bulk of your time on generating writing and revising the writing. So in this lesson, I might talk about what adjectives are, what adverbs are. I might even go into what metaphors and similes are in a lesson where maybe we've already talked about descriptive writing with adjectives and adverbs. And so again, they're learning a little bit about the grammar and language stuff that they love so much, but they're learning it in the context of something that they care about. Okay. So step 2 in the mini lesson is actually the writing part of the lesson. So what I think about, when I think about writing, I always think about, you know, when I first started working in adult literacy, it was like, give the students these writing prompts because they have to learn how to write these GD essays. And so give them the writing prompt and tell them they have to write a 5-paragraph essay. It is so daunting to say, I need you to get this, generate a 5-paragraph essay on this topic that you don't care about. I can understand why my students struggle with that. So I stopped doing that because it didn't help me to start them off with writing a 5-paragraph essay. If I can get them to write about something they care about, they'll go beyond 5 paragraphs without even thinking about it, right? So instead of giving them a full page essay to write, I would give them a note card and I would say, tell me about A, B, or C. And then they would have to respond. I might ask it in a question form so they would learn how to respond to a prompt. Or I could just, you know, just say, tell me about your first memory of school. And so all they had to do was fill out a little note card. Well, how many of us would freeze if we had to fill out a little note card? Maybe some of us who just really don't like writing, but it's a lot less daunting to fill out a little note card than it is to fill up a whole page with information. Another thing that I do is sometimes instead of using a page limit, I give them a time limit, because with a time limit, there's no pressure for what to produce. It's just, I want you to focus on this activity for this much time. So for 5 minutes, I just want you to write about whatever. And it doesn't matter if you get a full page and you get a quarter of a page, it doesn't matter. I've asked you to write for 5 minutes. That also gives people time. Folks who are very verbal learners have no problem generating that much information in a little bit of time, but people who are not verbal, people who are visual learners have to like think about what it is that they're seeing in their mind's eye, and then they have to translate that into the verbal language that they put on the page, and then they're worried about spelling and grammar and all those other things. So it gives people space to be who they are as a student, but it still gets you something, okay? So even if someone gives me just a note card worth of information, after I've collected 5 note cards from them, I can already see the patterns in their writing that I need to help them address in a writing lesson. So then you're going to get the writing. So there's research that talks about novice writers and the fact that novice writers, so there's 3 parts to the writing process, right? The first part of the writing process is actually planning what it is that you're going to write. The second part is generating what you're writing. And the third part is revising your writing, okay? So there was a study that was done that talked about how students, novice writers, spend 99% of their time generating. So they don't plan at all. They do very little revision. And so in the writer's workshop, part of what you're doing is getting them to start planning and then to get them to, you know, revise a little bit and revise and revise and revise. So one thing that I really like to do as a way to get students to generate writing is to start off with a 6-word memoir. So that's what I'm going to ask you all to do right now. So if you can share this in the chat if you would like to. If you would rather not share it in the chat, that's okay too. But what I'd like for you to share is, oops. Oh, sorry about that. What I'd like you to share is just, think of 6 words that you think could describe your life. What are 6 words that would tell your story? So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. And if I can find it, I'm sorry, working between 2 computers is kind of annoying. So a couple of examples that I can give you are I came, I saw, I conquered. That's one that a lot of us have heard before. For education, formal, informal, advance, up, ladder. Here's another, still searching for that silver lining. Here's one written by a student named Stormy Weather Banks. Never let no one steal your joy, right? Know you like that double negative in there, but that is a grammar lesson waiting to happen. So here's a funny one. My beer tastes like sawdust. That's somebody's life story, 6-word memoir. Sawdust is actually one word. We let them get away with that. Here's one for the time that we're living in. Together, we can make change now. So if you don't mind, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to try to come up with your own 6-word memoir. And if you can share it in the chat, I would love it. One minute to go. Okay, I'm seeing some examples in the chat. So I'm just gonna really quickly also say that, so when you're doing the 6-word memoir, when you're doing your writer's workshop and you give this activity, you're always gonna have people, oh, that's time. Okay, so you're always gonna have people who say, oh, I like that, Laura's working together to achieve peace and prosperity. Wow, crazy ride, more to come. Diana, very nice. So you're always gonna have students who say, well, what if I can only think of 7 words? No one's gonna die if they give 7 words instead of 6. So don't, like, I give 6 as kind of a guideline and kind of a challenge. But if a student does a 5-word or a 6-word memoir, who cares? Our whole purpose is to get them to write, right? So it doesn't matter if they don't exactly follow the rules. That's the good thing about a writer's workshop. There are only several rules that really, there are only a few rules that really, really count. Okay, so here's after they've done the writing, then, or once they've started the writing, the other part of the workshop is for the leader of the workshop to confer. And I say leader, not teacher, because sometimes the leader might be a student. You may have a student be the one to lead the writer's workshop. Let's say, for example, that let's say you're doing a writer's workshop, and during that writer's workshop, one of your students does something really well. You might want to confer with that student after class and have them lead the next writer's workshop. So you'll help them come up with a mini lesson about that thing that they do well. They'll prompt the students to write, and they'll be the ones to go around and read the students' writing and confer with them. So for conferring, what you're doing is you are looking at the students' writing to think with the mini lesson in mind, and you're thinking about how to give them individual feedback to help them. And sometimes you may get to a student who, like, as you're conferring, you may get to a student who hasn't been able to write anything. Let them off the hook and say, okay, so this prompt isn't doing it for you. Write about something else. It doesn't matter if they don't exactly follow your original planned format. It's actually nice when it doesn't follow that format, when it's just organic and it evolves because of the way that what's happening in your room. It's nice when things are co-created that way. So it doesn't have to be very rigid. So when you're conferring with the students, you're working with the students individually or working with the participants individually just to see kind of what they're coming up with or answering any questions they may have. Or you might just want to leave them alone and let them write and just let them know that if they want to confer, you're available to do that. If you're in the instructor role, you may actually want to confer, but just to make sure the students are going in the right direction. But it doesn't necessarily have to be, it doesn't, it's not very scripted. So you don't have to go around to every single student if you don't want to, but that's the time to do that, or to at least make yourself available. It's particularly helpful for the students who do have writer's block, because maybe what you do is just go and say, oh, I like what you've started. Can you tell me a little bit about this? And then ask questions to kind of help them generate. Sometimes what happens is they just have that bottleneck in their brains, and their brains are trying to come up with all these different things, but they're also trying to figure out how to put it on paper in the time that you're giving them, and they kind of get stuck. So that conference is a chance to give feedback, to ask questions, to help generate people, and to help the folks who are like, help me, to just get beyond that point of that paralysis that comes from being asked to write something, okay? Then this is the fun part, I think, for me, for the writer's workshop. So for the writer's workshop, what you're doing, so typically in class, typically in writing and instruction, what we do is we give students a writing sample, they give it back to us, we color it with our red pens, and we give it back to them, right? So I actually don't use red pens. Typically what I do is I'll get a writing sample from a student, I'll make a photocopy of that writing sample and give them their work back the way they gave it to me. And I'll make comments on the sample, on the copy that I've made, and I'll talk a little bit more about that process towards the end. But in the writing workshop, the feedback comes from the room. So it isn't about what the teacher thinks, it's about the student sharing. So what happens is, so the students all are working on their writing, or the participants are all working on their writing, and then you ask for volunteers, and you just say, are there 3 people who will be willing to share what you wrote? And so the person shares, and then they provide feedback. But there are rules to the feedback, okay? So with that feedback, we try to be very respectful. We try to be very appreciative. Remember, our point here is to encourage students to write more. And the one thing that discourages writing more than anything is criticism and unclear feedback. So with our feedback, it's a group share. And so the ground rules are, you have to pay attention to what other people are doing. So that's not the time to finish your masterpiece. That isn't the time to finish your masterpiece. It's the time to stop wherever you are and continue. So one thing that you build is a culture among your students that writing is never done. And there's a reason that there are different editions of the dictionary, right? We're never finished refining. That process goes on and on. There's a reason that there are different editions of all the books that we read. So this is a time to stop what you're doing and pay attention to the person who's sharing their writing. The second thing is, we always give the feedback in third person. So let's say that David, I see David's square lit up. So let's say that David writes something and I'm responding to David, I'm giving him feedback. So I've listened to him, I've paid attention to him, and now I'm going to give the feedback in third person. My feedback is going to be, I like how the author did blank. Okay. And that does a couple things, which I think are really cool. So first of all, what happens is, when you talk about the author, the focus is on the writing, especially if people are sharing personal experiences. You don't want your feedback to be about their experience. You want the feedback to be about what was written, but you also want to separate the author from their piece. So I like how the author did A, B, and C. I like how the author described the feeling of the warm concrete under the character's feet, instead of just saying it was a sunny day. I like how the author did whatever. So this does a couple things. So first of all, it makes it a lot less threatening. But the second thing it does is it changes the identity of your students. Now your students are not just students. They're not just writers. They are authors. I like how the author, and I will tell you that people actually take ownership of that. And I've done this training for educators across the country, and there's always one person in the room who's like, yes, yes. And then, or like, I actually had one student one adult educator in a session, and she said she started talking about herself in third person because she liked that the author, and she's like, well, the author did this, and it was just like, oh, you're claiming that for yourself, and she really did. So I like how the author did A, B, and C. And then the third rule is that it always has to be positive, because the purpose of a writer's workshop is to get people to improve their writing and to learn how to do things better. So it's not ever, well, you had a double negative. It's not about tearing people down. It's about validating their efforts. So the feedback is always very positive. So I'm going to ask if there are a couple of you who'd be willing to share your memoirs out loud on camera. So if there's anyone who'd be willing to do that, please let me know. Don't make me call on people. I'll do that. Been teaching a very long time. Okay, Diana says she will. Diana, do you mind turning your camera on and unmuting yourself?
Okay. Hi.
Okay, so wait, before I say that, everyone, please pay attention and be prepared to offer some type of feedback in third person to the author, okay? All righty.
This is my 6-word memoir about my life. Wild, crazy ride. More to come.
All right, thank you very much. Feedback from the audience. I'm gonna start calling on people. Diana, are you there? Diana Stonerock? Let's just bring the two Dianas together. Are you there? Y'all are hiding. Laura, did you unmute because you want to provide feedback?
Yeah, I'll provide feedback. Can you hear me?
I appreciate it. Yes, thank you.
Awesome. I live with the author wrote Wild Crazy Ride. It lets you know that it hasn't been all nice and smooth. It's had ups and it's had downs. I really like that. It's very, very dimensional. You know, it's all over the place. So I really like that part.
Thank you very much. That was very appreciative and positive. You followed all of the rules, so thank you so much for that. Is there anyone else who'd be willing to give the author feedback? Get used to this process. We're going to do this a couple times. You all are going to have to come out of your shells, okay? This is a very active session. I'm going to need a little bit more enthusiasm here. All right. So, Melissa, do you want to give the author some feedback? Or Amy? Amy's unmuted. Amy, would you like to give some feedback?
Yes, I like the way the author expresses a sense of motion in that.
Beautiful. That's great feedback. Thank you so much for that. Author, would you like to respond to any of that? Diana, would you like to respond to any of that?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I thank you to both Laura and Amy for pointing those things out. It made me think more about what I wrote, because those were both things were not intentional. Like I didn't know that I was doing that when I wrote that, but now that I see, yeah, it does show motion and it does show kind of ups and downs. So
All right. Beautiful. And how did it feel to be referred to as the author?
well, it made me feel darn important.
Right. Right. So it changes the student's identity when they start to hear themselves refer to the author and they're getting this positive feedback. So how much more do you think that they'd be willing to write now that they're getting this feedback, that they're getting this validation as authors? It just really is an appreciative process, and it's meant to build everyone up and to get them encouraged. So another thing that you could really use as an instructor to take advantage of this is you can say, you know what? I did think that Diana's piece showed a little bit more motion. So why don't we all go back to our pieces and read through them again and see if there's some place where we can use some language to create motion. And maybe we'll do a brainstorm on the board and think of ways that we might describe something that shows a little bit more motion or action in our stories. So it's a way to say, well, maybe we need more action words. What are some action words? And what's the technical term for action words? What will we actually do? So it could be, we could do an impromptu lesson on verbs. We've already talked about adjectives and adverbs. So now we're talking about verbs in a little bit greater detail. So it's a way, it's like the writer's workshop is a living, moving, organic thing, and it becomes whatever it becomes within the session. But the point is the students are writing. They're writing willingly, they're getting positive feedback, they're being built up as writers, they're more likely to try their writing again. And now they're applying that writing to something that they're actually, they're applying it to something that they're actually interested in, and so they're more likely to retain it. So let's go to the next slide, which is taking your 6-word memoir and then turning that 6-word memoir into 6 bullets, okay? So think about, so maybe Diana will take her passage and then maybe describe that wild ride. And it can be 6 really separate bullets. For someone whose 6-word memoir is I came, I saw, I conquered, they might write I came into the world, and then I came into this company. I conquered my fear, and then I conquered whatever, whatever. So you can use it however you want. But the idea here is to help students focus on the process of planning. So you've just asked them to do a 6-word memoir. And that 6-word memoir was, they had 2 minutes, 3 minutes to come up with a 6-word memoir. They can write 6 words, 5 words, 7 words, right? So they've already generated something. They've already gotten feedback for it. And so now you're going to ask them to expand that a little bit more. And this is the planning part of the writing process that we don't always get students to engage in, but it's the activity itself is making them plan out their writing. So you're going to say, I want you to write 6 bullets that are going to help you expand your story for me. So I'm going to give you all 3 minutes to write 6 bullets. Actually, I'll give you 2 minutes to write 6 bullets based on your memoir. And I'm looking for volunteers. So write something you want to share. Go ahead. One minute to go. Twenty 20 seconds. All right. Is there anyone who's interested in sharing their 6 bullets? If you don't mind, mute yourself. And if you don't mind coming on camera, that would be great too. Anyone? Okay, so Diana, do you mind if I share yours? You share them in the chat. Do you mind if I read them? Diana Stone Rock, do you mind? Or actually, I would love it if you read them, because if they're giving feedback, they want to give it to the actual author, not to the facilitator, right? All right, you guys are too quiet. I need this group in person so I can really, okay. Do you want to read it, or do you want me to? Okay, I'll read it in the interest of time, and then I'm going to be looking for someone to give feedback, so someone can give feedback to the author. I'm just the reader, okay? So the 6-word memoir is, the 6 bullets is, I live in the country, I've enjoyed my family, I smile through my tears, singing is therapy, giving was instilled at a young age, learning daily always makes me a better person. Okay, can I get anyone to give a little bit of feedback to the author?
This is Laura. I'll start with this. I love how the author is saying she lets us know that she has a family in the country and she loves to sing, and giving was instilled to her at a young age. Lets her know that this is a generational thing. She just didn't learn to just wake up one day and decide she's going to be a giving person. she probably has a very giving, probably grandparents and parents who taught her that she should be, you know, always a giving person. And learning daily, again, that probably comes from a good background, a good, and she says living in the country, so she probably had a good work ethic, learning daily. I'm thinking a lot of things is generational for the author. And it really lets me know in the author that they've had ups and downs. You know, she smiles through tears. It really lets me know that what the saying is like, and basically that, you know, she's a very, very strong family life and uh, a really good core of what she can do to what's uplifting to her. It's a
Absolutely.
sticky that's uplifting. So I really sort of it basically paints a picture of how she is. And like I said, actually don't think I've ever met Diana. I think I know a whole lot about her right now.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate you participating. I like how the author used the line, I smile through my tears, because I feel like that's something that a lot of people can connect to. And a lot of our writing is about connection. So at this point, I just want to point out that when Laura shared her feedback to the author, what she did is she told things that she likes to hear when she's reading, right? So basically what you're describing for students is what good reading, you know, what readers look for, what readers like to see in their reading. So you're describing to your students what they want to include in their writing. And so it's giving them that feedback from a couple of different ways, because they have opportunities to read each other's work. They may listen to each other's work. Now, there are also times where you may break them down into small groups, and they may just share with one person so that everyone gets a chance to have an audience to share. Some people aren't willing to do the whole group, but having them share with a partner, they'll do that, and they're still able to get feedback. I could take that line, I smile through my tears, and say, can we all look at our passages and see if there's some place where we can kind of help the person feel, try to think of how to describe how we felt in a way that other people can connect to or relate to. I smile through all my tears. We've all done that. So try to think of a way to create that same feeling in your piece. So it's an iterative process that makes them go deeper and deeper and deeper into their writing. So the next thing that I would do with the group is have them do a 6-minute memoir. So now they've got 6 words. They've expanded that 6 words to 6 bullets. And I would just give them 6 minutes to try to tell a story based on that, to write a story based on that. So what they're doing is they're planning and generating, and then they're getting the feedback from their author, and then from all of the audience, and then I may take some of that feedback and get them to go back and revise their writing. So that research I told you about before, where students spend 99% of their time writing, but no time planning and no time revising, we flip that on its head by making them do that through every step of the process, and by looking at those examples of good writing so that they're learning about it experientially, so that they're actually doing it, so that they're reading it and hearing it from other people. And it's a lesson that's definitely going to land a lot more than the standard, here's your worksheet with the different parts of speech on it, memorize them and go forward. They're actually learning how to use them all. So with the revising, a lot of what, especially with memoir writing, is you're trying to awaken the senses. What are the things that this person heard when she stepped outside that might help us know that it's summertime and not winter? What are some of the, like maybe she heard a lawnmower in the distance, and that sets the scene, right? So we're helping students with the mini lesson on show, don't tell. We're helping them to figure out ways to create the scene for their reader in ways that really kind of engages the senses, that uses what a person might have seen or heard or smelled, which is really interesting because sometimes those smells can transport us to a place that we, like a couple days ago, a couple days ago, I don't know what was happening, I got a whiff, and it was like I smelled my friend's grandmother's house. I haven't been in that woman's house in probably 40 years. But I smelled her house instantly. So like sometimes there are things that we can smell, like the butterscotch or the smell of, cake baking or whatever, that really can transport people to a different place in their own life. So I would go back to what is the purpose of this mini lesson and how can we include and incorporate that? What if you added another adjective somewhere or another adverb? So you can see how you're using the writing process to kind of get students engaged. So the thing that I like to do is to get students to just generate a writing sample. And then again, like I said, I make a copy of their writing sample and give them their work back. And on that copy, I analyze their writing and I look at the kinds of mistakes that they're making. If there's a lot of noun-verb agreement, if they're using your instead of your, if they're having difficulty with contractions, if they're struggling with possessive S versus plural S. I look at the kinds of things that they're doing in their writing, and then I have a general picture of what they're doing. So a student may give me a writing sample. There may be 40 errors in their writing, but maybe the 40 errors are all noun-verb agreement. So if I help that student with noun-verb agreement, it'll change their entire writing sample. So that's kind of where I focus, instead of just going like, well, here's a noun and here's a verb. Instead of giving them those very didactic lessons that don't really mean anything, the Writers Workshop gives you a chance to kind of give them critical feedback, the feedback that they specifically need on writing that they care about making better. One prompt that I really like using is, who's the person who's going to be the most supportive or the most proud when you get your GED, or when you reach whatever it is that your academic goal is? Because that brings up a lot of emotion for people, the folks who are in their corner and the folks who are kind of doubting them. So I use that. And what I might also do is look at the data for, if I'm doing it as a group, I may look at the data for the group as a whole and say, well, if every single one of the students is struggling with noun-verb agreement, well, my next mini lesson needs to be on noun-verb agreement. And then the lessons that occur more often, those are the lessons that I'm going to prioritize, because those are the ones that are impacting more of my students' writing. And then after generating the data, I can plan my instruction that's focused and it's contextualized because it's on their writing and it's relevant. Okay, so the research, Fogel and Airy did a study in 2000, and they looked at students who spoke Black English vernacular or African American vernacular English. And the focus of the study was to expose students to standard English and to see how they improved. And so the students were in 3 different groups. One group just was told that they made errors. The second group was told that they made errors and they got an explanation for why their mistakes were wrong. And the third group were told about their errors, they were told why they were wrong, and they were given guided practice in correcting them. Well, you can imagine the third group is the group that actually started incorporating those writing practices into their writing. So helping students with things that are like giving them an opportunity to go back and correct and revise their writing actually helps them to internalize and apply and remember the writing lessons that you're giving them far more than a worksheet ever will. You can give specific instruction on those syntactic rules, give them that guided practice with feedback, and just help them to realize that writing is not a solitary practice. Most of us don't write in a vacuum either. So for sample writing prompts, I like to ask students about things like just give them questions, or maybe even give them an image of something to react to. It doesn't necessarily have to be a GED essay just to get students to start generating. In fact, it's better if it isn't, because the more information that they're able to generate from something that they can connect to or personal experience, it's a lot easier for them to generate something. And then all you need is that initial, that the whole purpose of it is to get them to be willing to write, so that you can give them feedback, so that you can make them better writers, so that they are then willing to do the GED writing or the high set writing or whatever that you need them to do. So are there any questions about this process? Are there any questions about, so I'll just tell you that OASE is going to provide the slideshows and the recordings to everyone. After this is over, they'll still be available to you. So if you want to look at those references, they'll be in the slideshow that you get. But does anyone have any questions or comments about any of what we've talked about? Do you see how easy it is to facilitate as a writer's workshop? It's just giving them a lesson, getting them to write, conferring with them about what it is that they're writing, giving them opportunities to share, and then just using that as an iterative process for however much time you have, giving them feedback, asking them to experiment with trying certain things in their writing, and then improving their writing incrementally. The other thing that I think is really nice is if you are focusing on digital literacy in your program, if the students are able to type their writing and to learn how to put that in like a word processing program, if they're able to save as, if you teach them how to save as, then they have all of these versions of their writing, so you can print them out for them and they can see how their writing has improved from revision to revision to revision. I do that with my own writing. It's like really nice to see what I had, my initial draft of something, and to see what the revisions are like after I've had some feedback from some people can be really nice. So any questions? You are the quietest group I think I've ever presented to in my entire life. I think the Zoom thing is not as much fun as I thought it was, because you can hide in Zoom. You can't hide in an actual room. Well, I appreciate Laura and Diana, I appreciate you. And then who else helped me? Was it Amy? I appreciate all of you who are willing to speak up and participate a little bit. It really does help to have folks who are willing to do that.
Yeah, Carmen, this is Laura. Carmen, I'm sorry, I mispronounced your name.
It's Carmen.
It's Carmen. Okay, I really appreciate this because it's really gives you like building blocks instead of just going, we're going to do an essay. I really liked how you just took 6 words and to really expand it. And when you were just talking, you were talking about using your senses. And so first thing I thought about when I was reading Diana's Living in the Country, my first thought when she expanded that was my grandparents had a 100-acre farm, and I grew up playing there on the weekends. The first thing when I was reading through hers, the first thing I thought of is tasting that well water. So you're right. Yeah. It hits your senses when you take it apart and you add it a little bit deeper. And that's really cool that we just said that. It was exactly the same thing I was thinking at the same exact time. So I really like that. You think you really go on the differences in the food and how much better the food is there because it's all fresh, not processed. And you can rebuild up on all kinds of different things with that. So I really do appreciate that.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. And thank you, Diana. I hope that this works out. One other thing that I will say that I've used is that using a 2-way journal with students where the students write anything and then I respond to it. That's another way to get students to really, really write. And just so if you just need a way to generate a writing sample and you don't want to do a writer's workshop, that's another way to get students to write about experiences, which gives you a writing sample that you can use to give them feedback on their writing. So, okay, so we have to do a hard stop at 11 because you need to have your break before you go into the afternoon sessions. Thank you all for attending. I appreciate it very much. There's a note from Adrian.
Great session.
Thank you. There's a note from Adrian to please do the survey after the session. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great conference.